Okay, so welcome to Rethinking Psychiatry's Sunday, July 11th presentation with Sera Davidow of the Afiya Peer Respite, creating alternatives to hospitalization. And this is the continuation of our Soteria and Peer Respite series of talks that Rethinking Psychiatry is presenting. And it will be leading up to the Peer Respite Soteria Summit that Rethinking Psychiatry and Mind Freedom International and several other organizations are working together to create. It will be an online international summit to give people the tools, resources, and support to bring these alternatives to your communities. So to be notified of upcoming events, upcoming speakers on Peer Respite and the summit, please put your email address in the chat here and go to rethinkingpsychiatry.org, click the red button and sign up for our newsletter. Also, everybody here is welcome. This is a free event, but if you want to support the work that we're doing, feel free to go to rethinkingpsychiatry.org and click the green button and make a donation if you want. Though it's very important to us that all of our events are accessible to everyone. So nobody is required to donate. I wanted to make a note on confidentiality for this event. The names of who's here are able to be seen to each other. Those of us who are live here, but not in the video. You can rename yourself by right-clicking on your picture or in the participants button at the bottom. You can right click and rename yourself if you don't want to have your real name available to other people. But like I said, it's not going to be on the video. You can turn your video on to be seen by everybody or off. But again, nobody's video will be in the recording unless it's those of us who are consenting ahead of time. Please put your questions in the chat. And Kathy will be stockpiling them and will share them with Sera at the end of the talk. If it's a question that you're having trouble, you don't understand an acronym or something, then Kathy will let Sera know so that she can clarify in the course of the talk. I wanted to start where Rethinking Psychiatry has begun making an Indigenous land acknowledgement at the beginning of our talks. This is from Northwestern University. It's important to understand the longstanding history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our own present participation. And this from Mary Lyons of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. When we talk about land, land is part of who we are. It's a mixture of our blood, our past, our current, and our future. We carry our ancestors in us, and they're around us, as you all do. And so I wanted to acknowledge that Rethinking Psychiatry started in Portland, Oregon, where I am now at the confluence of the Willamette and the Columbia Rivers. And so many peoples made their homes here. Where I am specifically, the Clackamas peoples, the Confederated Tribe of the Grand Ronde peoples, the Cowlitz, and the Multnomah peoples all traditionally had their homes here. And many people still live here and caretake the land and the community. Portland is also, I believe, the 9th largest place of Native peoples from all over the country, and no doubt Canada as well. So thank you for having us as your uninvited guests. Please feel free to learn more about who the peoples are, if where you live, perhaps you are Native where you live, and find out the ways that you can, land acknowledgement is a beginning, not an end. So hopefully with this, people will learn more and will learn how to be more in relationship and allyship. So I wanted to make sure that people knew who Rethinking Psychiatry is. We are all volunteer. We're an independent educational activist group. We are rethinking psychiatry, creating community, educating and activating for choices. We're part of a larger movement working to promote healing and choices in and beyond our mental health care system. And we always want to give credit to Molly of Reimagining Recovery for the language of in and beyond our mental health care system. We're made up of people with lived experience of extreme states, alternate states, professionals, family members, and other allies, and we are not affiliated with, we do not receive any funding from or promote any religious organization, government entity, corporation, or drug company. I want to thank the core members who are here. I know I am, David is here, Cindy, I believe, is here. Hopefully Jack is here. Lots of us. Rachel, it's her birthday today. Happy birthday, Rachel. She is not here. But we want to invite you to join us. Let us know you're interested, again, by putting your name into the chat. You could put it just to the host if you want, or to everyone. And again, you can put it out to the you can sign up directly at rethinkingpsychiatry.org. So we invite you to be respectful and kind in the chat, speak your truth and make space for others to speak theirs. And we honor multiple truths. We're here to learn together. I want to make sure that we are, excuse me. There might be other people waiting in the chat, there we go. Great, people have been able to come in, so good. I was worried that maybe there were other people waiting to come in. So with this, I want to invite Sera Davidow to share with us her many years of experience with Afiya Peer Respite and with what used to be called the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community and is now called the Wildflower Alliance. Sera was the original person working on the grant for the Afiya Peer Respite and also writes for Mad in America and is just all around a badass activist and organizer. And we are so excited she is here. And I will turn over to Sera. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Grace, Kathy, and everyone here for joining us today. So as Grace said, my name's Sera. I've been a part of the Wildflower Alliance for really as long as it's been in the visioning process. And so I try to count those years. It's been something like 14-ish years since it began this visioning process and then became funded. And Afiya Peer Respite joined our community as the first peer respite in Massachusetts in 2012. I want to just talk briefly before I get more into peer respite about what the Wildflower Alliance is. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I just wanted to have those of you who are less familiar with us have a sense of it. This is our mission statement. And I'm just going to read it out loud for people. The Wildflower Alliance supports healing and empowerment for our broader communities and people who have been impacted by psychiatric diagnosis, trauma, extreme states, homelessness, problems with substances, and other life-interrupting challenges. We do this through peer-to-peer support and genuine human relationships, alternative healing practices, learning opportunities, and advocacy. Essential to our work is recognizing and undoing systemic injustices such as racism, sexism, ableism, transphobia, transmisogyny, and psychiatric oppression. And this isn't our original mission statement. Our original mission statement was much more focused on developing peer-to-peer networks and offering peer-to-peer support, which is still such a core part of who we are. But we learned very quickly that if that was our focus and we weren't looking beyond that, then everything that was going on in the world just continued, and we were just kind of keeping ourselves busy with the same things over and over. And really, we want to change the world. And so we really wanted to broaden our focus. And so the first thing we changed was what is represented in that top paragraph. It used to just talk about people with a history of psychiatric diagnosis, extreme states, trauma. The reality is that we live in a world that puts us in boxes, and systems that put us in boxes that are often related to whatever door we walk through or are pushed through when we first are struggling in some way. And very few of us actually only fit in one box. We often struggle with many different things, and we see ourselves as a much richer community for understanding that whether someone's struggling with substances or the legal system or being unhoused or has been diagnosed or what have you, that so much of it roots back to our environments, our trauma, so much of what's happened to us that has led us down these paths. And we're a richer community for recognizing that and making space for all our different struggles. So really the only struggle that we don't, or the only people we don't make space for are people who show up with clipboards and want to stand in the corner and observe us. We still invite students and reporters to participate in ways that we can control, but we don't give them open access because too many of us have been harmed by research or journalists or what have you. But everyone else, if they think that they have a reason to benefit from or offer to this community, we assume that they know that and that our community is richer for their presence. We also changed that bottom part. It didn't used to recognize systemic oppression in the same way, but we realized very, very early on that a huge percentage of our community had been impacted by systemic oppression, and that we wanted to name that in our mission statement because it's so key that we're not only recognizing the realness of the oppressions we've experienced and the harms we've experienced in this world, but naming it so that we can raise awareness and also seek to undo some of those harms. And of course, we couldn't name every form of systemic oppression, so we centered those that we thought were really key to name, like racism, or others that often don't get named as often, like ableism and transmisogyny. And then this last piece is represented by my creepy arm image. A lot of my coworkers don't like the creepy arm image, but it seems to stick in people's heads when I use it. So I think of it, sometimes we talk about having 4 parts, but this is the 4 arms that I like to use in presentations. And still, the peer-to-peer support is our best funded piece, and that is where Afiya sits. So I'm going to come back to that, and that's where we're going to spend most of this presentation. But we also want you to be aware that we also spend time with alternative healing practices, and some of that overlaps with the peer support. And alternative healing practices is about creating free access to things like acupuncture and yoga and sound healing and Reiki and whatever, it varies depending on the month and year and resources available. But it's not because, and sometimes people will say, oh, that's the group that thinks acupuncture fixes everything. Nope, we don't believe that, but we do believe choice is huge, and that so many people don't have choices and are forced and lose power in these systems because they're only given, they're told they have choices, but they're not real choices. You have a choice between these 2 things that people are actually saying you have to do is not a real choice. And so this isn't about saying everyone should be using these alternative healing practices, but it is about saying that if you're not using it because you had a choice and decided it wasn't for you, that's a very different experience than if you just never have access. And so we create that access as best as we can. We also have this individual and systems advocacy piece that can look just like going to an appointment with someone, because probably many of you know that if you go to an appointment with someone and there's a witness there, those appointments tend to look different than if someone's just on their own. But it also looks like making sure that people who've sometimes been so institutionalized that they've lost their internal fire and understanding that they can say no or ask why, sometimes for good reason, because there's been consequences for saying no or asking why, that actually there's a whole community of people where they can go and not just be the one person saying no or asking why, but do that as a whole community and push back. And protests and talking about human rights and all that, it's not where everyone gets their fire, but I've seen people who've gone to a protest, say at a pushing back on the Boston Globe for their coverage on mental health. And I've seen them realize that they're saying no and pushing back with this whole community of people, and that reignites their fire, and that can be so important. And then there's this consultation and learning opportunities piece. So some of you know that we do training on hearing voices and peer respite, of course, but also alternatives to suicide and trauma and so many other things. And we also create films, and I'm going to show you a few clips of our films and a book that I'll mention to you today, Peer Respite Handbook. So we do a lot to get our learning out there because, again, we want to change the world. So I'm going to stop with that. But the last piece I just want to mention is why we changed our name. So we changed our name from the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community to Wildflower Alliance for a number of reasons. One is that the Western Mass piece was confusing. We've done trainings now in multiple countries, and certainly across this country. We do most of the hearing voices training, for example, for this country. And the Western Mass piece was just confusing people. It was getting in our way. So we wanted to shed some of that because our focus is broader, but also because the word recovery doesn't work so well for a lot of us. For some of us, you know, some of my coworkers, some of the people in our community say, there's not much I want to recover from my past. I want to discover, I want to build something new. And other people, for example, autistic people in our community, many people say, you know, this word recover, it doesn't fit me. What I want is to live in a world that acknowledges my existence and the ways that I'm different and doesn't try to erase me. And for others of us like me, it just feels like a box. You know, I shed my diagnoses that a system gave me. I don't want to carry around this recovery word that the system also tells me I need to focus on for the rest of my life. I tend to say when I share my story that why is what so many people in this world with all the bumps and ups and downs they experience, why is what they get to call life what I'm supposed to call recovery for the rest of my existence simply because I was once diagnosed. So I want to push back on that. So we shed that and we moved to Wildflower Alliance through an extremely labored process of asking the community and so many people what they thought and votes and all that. And eventually we came to Wildflower Alliance because wildflowers are often mistaken for weeds. Their beauty gets missed, but they actually possess great beauty. And they form these really strong underground networks with their roots. And they're often seen as having healing properties. And that is how we came to this name. So with that, I want to move into talking to you about peer respite. And I am going to show you a clip. There's 3 clips I'm going to show you today. This first one is about peer respite, just more broadly. What is it? And what is some of the history, at least in this country, of where peer respite came from? And all these clips will be pretty short, but I'm going to start this one out.
A peer respite is a non-clinical environment set up specifically to support people going through difficult times, to avoid hospital, move through their distress, and toward a better place. It is developed, led, and run by people who themselves have been diagnosed, hospitalized, and/or experienced trauma. In truth, the idea of creating a sort of home away from home in which to help people avoid psychiatric hospitalization has been going on for several decades. One early effort was the Crisis Hostel in Ithaca, New York, around about 1993. While not entirely peer-to-peer, the hostel was a huge step in that direction. In truth, to be considered a pure peer respite, all team members must identify as having had their own experiences, including those in leadership roles. And if the house is part of a larger organization, it's not a clinical one and is governed by a board where people with personal experience are also strongly represented. By that definition, the first peer respite was Stepping Stones, developed in Claremont, New Hampshire in 1995 by Sherry Mead and friends. By 2012, there were about a dozen pure and hybrid peer respites throughout the country. And then there was Afiya. Lucky number 13. Afiya was officially born on Saturday, August the 4th, 2012 in Northampton, Massachusetts. A group called the Groundhogs, yes, I said it, the Groundhogs, was actually visioning and advocating for respites in Massachusetts for several years before. So when it finally happened, everyone was more than ready to go. The team had been told to expect things to start out slowly, but someone came to stay that very first day, and the house has been full almost ever since.
All right, so that clip is out of our full Afiya Peer Respite film, which you'll see in the links that I'll offer at the end. You can also find on the Afiya website, and the other two clips I'll show you are also coming from that film. But at this point, before we get to more clips, I just want to read to you Afiya's mission. Afiya strives to provide a space in which each person can find the balance and support needed to turn what is so often referred to as a crisis into a learning and growth opportunity. You're going to see that theme repeated in different ways throughout this presentation because it's so important. We live in a society that tells us what emotions are good and what emotions are bad. And if you have the bad emotions, then they inevitably have something they want to sell you that will make it all better. And instead, peer respite is really rooted in this idea that there's value in all emotions. There's value in grief and sadness and struggle, and even things like that get very clearly classified in this society as a problem, like suicidal thoughts or hearing really distressing voices. They're seen as these problems we must erase and get rid of at all costs, when in fact, they can carry meaning and messages if we're given space to explore and move through them. And so that is what this idea is getting at, this mission statement here. And it's really at the foundation of what peer respite is about. And a lot of us use intentional peer support as one of our core trainings. It's not the only piece that we use, but intentional peer support is a training approach that was also developed by Sherry Mead, and Chris Hansen and many others have supported it over the years to grow and develop. And it also is an approach that says, hey, you know, what you're going through, there's something to be learned from this. How did you come to believe what you believe? How did you come to be at this point in your life that you're at? And what's working for you, what's not? And how can we move forward from here? So that's a key piece to how we move forward at Afiya as well. Now I'm going to show you another clip here that is focused on Afiya, just a little bit about the house. You will notice that this film refers to us as Western Mass Recovery Learning Community. It was created a few years ago, so it's going to refer to some of those pieces that are a little out of date in that way, but I think you'll get the idea.
Peer respites across the country vary in a number of ways, including who can stay and for how long. At Afiya, just about anyone in the region who is 18 or older and experiencing significant emotional or mental distress is welcome to have a conversation with someone working at the house about whether or not Afiya is a good fit, especially if they are trying to avoid hospitalization or other more restrictive interventions. If everyone involved decides it is a fit, then the person is able to stay up to 1 week. While there, anyone staying can expect access to their own private room and community spaces, peer-to-peer support focused on turning crisis into a learning opportunity, resource information, and the ability to connect freely with the broader community. In fact, Afiya is connected to the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community, or RLC. The RLC is a large network of people working within 4 branches: advocacy and activism, alternative healing practices, training and consultation, and peer-to-peer supports. This last branch is, of course, where Afiya sits. The RLC also operates within a values-based framework, and that definitely applies at Afiya. Everyone working or staying at the house is asked to be personally responsible for taking part in holding values like self-determination, mutuality, creating a healing environment, and respect. Some may say that that's too much to expect of someone going through a hard time, but this reflects their belief that people are still capable, even when struggling, and is critical to who we are and how we work.
So You probably heard in there that people have their own room. And there's lots I could say about the house, and certainly ask more questions at the end if you want more details that I don't offer you. But I want to highlight that piece. People have their own rooms. I don't know where we got this idea in these systems that have been built around us that the best thing for somebody who's in a really deep place of distress is to be roomed with a stranger. I know that when I was in a psychiatric facility in Florida, I was put in with a stranger, and then I also had all these other rules that were happening around me, and I didn't sleep. It didn't feel okay to me. It was probably the opposite of what I could have envisioned as a healing environment. And so there is trust that has to happen in these peer respites. People are sometimes afraid that if someone's, I guess, in a room by themselves, especially if the room can lock, which these rooms can lock, that something bad will happen. But I think part of, unfortunately, what happens in this system is we create these systems where people are constantly told that they are broken, not necessarily out loud in those words, but that's the message that's conveyed to them. You're broken. You can't be trusted. You can't make decisions for yourself. And I see over and over again that people live up to those expectations sometimes. They internalize those expectations. And if we can move towards a system where there's spaces like these that say, no, actually, even though we know you're really struggling, we still have trust in you and we're going to work through this together. And therefore, yeah, you can have a room that locks where you can go and be by yourself. That is much more likely to create a healing space for people. So I want to go through some myths, and there's a zillion myths that I could offer you about peer respite. There's more of them if you want to go watch that film. And I'm going to pull out some different ones that aren't as reflected in that film. And one of them that I just want to start with, because I see it happening all around me, not just with peer respite, but with all sorts of, it's that sort of not in my backyard mentality. People seem to believe that peer respite is going to attract lots of dangerous people into their neighborhoods where they otherwise would not be. And I just, I want to say that the reality is that there are people, and I suspect that all of you who've chosen to come to this presentation know this already, but there are people out there who are struggling every place that we all exist. It's just, it's very human to struggle and to sometimes struggle very deeply. And so the people are already there. And sometimes people are actively avoiding support because they've been hurt by the things that were supposed to help in the past. So if you're familiar with Pat Deegan actually is based in Massachusetts, but that's not why I'm choosing to share about her now. I'm choosing because I love a quote that she offers. That quote is, help doesn't help if it doesn't help, or help is not help if it doesn't help, to clarify. And I love that quote because we live in a system of so much help that doesn't help and sometimes hurts. And so sometimes those people are there actively avoiding support because they've been harmed in the past. And peer respite actually, it doesn't attract people out of nowhere. They didn't fall out of the sky suddenly because peer respite exists now, but it gives a space where people who are already there and already struggling can maybe now get some support. And so if there was any potential danger, which often there just wasn't to begin with anyway, peer respites are actually far more likely to reduce that danger than increase it. So I just wanted to offer that. Now, another myth is that folks who work at peer respite are only equipped to deal with, maybe we'll just offer you a distraction, we'll keep you busy, but oh my gosh, if anyone talks about suicide, or if someone cuts themselves, or someone wants to come off their psychiatric drugs, we better bring in the experts at that point. That is a really, really common myth. And unfortunately, there are some peer respites out there that perpetuate that myth by saying that they're not really for crisis. Peer respite really is intended as an alternative to hospital, which means it is for people who are in what gets called crisis. And what we would argue, based on our experience of several years at this point, is that people in peer roles are often better prepared than many other people to be in really difficult conversations about taboo topics because they've lived it, they've seen it in their communities, and all their training and personal experience emphasizes the importance of being able to sit in darkness and talk about really difficult things openly. It's just the reality of it. I'll tell you, I don't have time to share big stories here. If you're in other trainings with me, you've perhaps heard me share about my own experience with suicidal thoughts and self-injury. And and then some of the resources that are out there. I went to a training on suicide prevention that was not our own to better understand their approach. And I was in a room full of mostly clinicians, some of whom had been practicing for decades. And many of them were admitting that the thing that they were most terrified to talk about, did not feel confident talking about, was suicide. I'm like, how have you been able to practice all these years and not get comfortable talking about these big things? We have to be able to talk about them. And there's also this idea that if we share things like, no graphic detail, probably many of you have heard, that's graphic details, that's bad, that's going to quote unquote trigger somebody. And we come from a very different place with that as well. When we tell people that they can't share details of what's going on for them, we're communicating a lot of messages. And some of those messages are things like, what you went through is so incredibly horrible that I can't even stand to hear about it. And I don't know how that then suggests, oh, well, but you can heal from it, just don't talk about it. I also don't really get this idea. We don't really use triggering language in our community. There's a lot of weird military language integrated into mental health world, and guns and violence, like trigger, for example. But we do recognize that sometimes one person's experiences and things they're talking about can bring big things up for other people. But instead of trying to avoid that, we actually just try and make space for saying like, oh, wow, this person was talking about this. It seems like it brought something up for you. Do you want to talk about that too? Rather than let's avoid all those feelings. That gets back to that idea that the point is just to erase and avoid and get rid of. And this quote that I have on the screen right now actually came from someone who was in one of our alternative suicide classes. And she made this point of, like, where did we get to this point where one person's need to talk about big things is less important than other people's need to not hear it? So there is an importance in consent, looking for people who are willing to be in those conversations, and peer respite is a great place for that. And the moment we start thinking, everyone's fragile and can't handle it, we erase just yet one more space where people could actually maybe talk about and move through some of the things that are happening in their life. So this one might be a tough one depending on who's in the audience right now, but I'm just going to offer it. So myth: advanced degrees aren't required to be employed at a peer respite, but they are a bonus. The part that's a myth is that they are a bonus. I'm going to be real honest. They're not necessarily a deal breaker, but I want to be clear that when people have been through a lot of training in the mental health realm based around conventional clinical responses, it can actually be harder for them to learn new things because they also have to unlearn a lot of other stuff they've been taught. So when someone comes and says, oh, I have a master's degree in advanced clinical work, we won't write them off depending on what their experience is, but it won't necessarily be seen as the plus. I want to be really clear about this because this also gets at the idea that, oh, a lot of people hold that peer respites would be better if we did actually have clinicians working with us, or if we were under big clinical organizations. And there are some peer respites that are relatively successful that have managed to navigate being connected to clinical organizations. But I want to be really clear with you, it's an additional barrier. It's an additional barrier because those organizations have been doing things in the same way for many years. They are doing things that they might not even necessarily realize they're doing because it's so integrated into who they are. And there's a huge unlearning process that has to happen. And it can be really hard to be a peer respite going into and being based at a clinical organization where they not only have to try and make change in their outer community, advocate for change in their outer community, but also push back on the people who have a lot of power over them because they are holding their funding and providing their supervision. So I just want to be really clear that this is something to really, I hope you all will really hold with you if you're supporting peer respites to develop, that it can be really challenging when there's a lot of clinical beliefs around, a lot to unlearn. Another myth. So for people who are used to being told what's wrong with them and what to do about it, going to a peer respite is almost always an easy and welcome change. All right. I do think for a lot of people, it's really positive, but there are many people who are really, really used to being told what's wrong with them and being told what they need to do about it. And it can actually feel scary when someone finally says, no, well, what do you think? I don't have the answers. What do you think? We've been trained that doctors have the answer, no matter how many times. It's not even just in the psychiatric world. I go to a medical doctor because something's going wrong in my body. I want them to have the answer, and they're supposed to, and often they profess to have an answer. Our system actually does a lot of harm by pretending it has answers that it doesn't have and not being willing to say, we're not really sure, let's explore this together. But we internalize those things, and that means that sometimes there's a transition period. I'm actually going to show you another clip at this point that will get at that transition period, but I just really hope that you will also take this piece away with you, that sometimes when someone has just gone to a peer-to-peer support for the first time or peer respite for the first time, they may still be looking for being told what to do, and it may come as a pretty big culture shock that that's not what's happening. And that doesn't have to mean that it's bad, and it doesn't have to mean that it's a bad fit for them. Nothing is going to be for everyone. So peer respite is not going to be for everyone. Soteria, none of these alternatives are going to be for everybody. But there is a pretty significant group of people who might go to peer respite, hear that the people at the peer respite don't have the answer and aren't going to tell them what to do, and get freaked out, but then move through that and discover many, many things about themselves. So I'm going to show you this clip of somebody who spent some time at our peer respite that's going to get at this point.
So I was at this point of facing involuntary commitment, and I had slowly got off my medication, and things had gone well for a while, but now I was hitting a bumpy spot. And the bumpy spot was getting tougher and tougher, and my service providers were like, you know, we've given you a while, things aren't getting better, we think you need to go back to the hospital. So at one point, when I was getting the ultimatum, I just ran and hid in the woods. And things were not getting better. And I really wanted to have a chance to see if I could go through this extreme state without going to the hospital, because when I've gone to the hospital, not only did I have to recover from that extreme state, I had to recover from the trauma of having been in the hospital. I didn't know if it would work, but I wanted the chance to see if I could try a different way to get through this experience. And I was able to go to Afiya and be in my extreme state and sleep odd hours and be able to have a coherent conversation and not be able to have a coherent conversation. And what I discovered was that I could go through an extreme state without being extremely medicated. And it really forced me to try to look at different strategies. When I went there, people said, what can we do to help you? And that kind of freaked me out, because normally people would say, this is what you need to do. We'll put you on this medication, da, 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 da. And instead, I had to experiment and see what was helpful for me. And I learned a lot about how to manage those experiences in a more self-directed way. We worked out this thing at Afiya where each of my kids came, and the people working there were able to sit and talk with us, and I didn't feel like people were on two different sides. It wasn't about, how to make Marty compliant. It was more like how to make this work, and what does everybody in this group need? And we were able to negotiate that, and that was something that had never happened in the past.
So one of the pieces that you saw there at the end with Marty, who also, many of you are familiar with Marty. Marty's on our training team at this point and goes by Cindy most of the time at this point. But so that family piece at the end, I think, is also really important. There's a lot that happens in the mental health system and the conventional system that really does focus, okay, this person is the problem. This is the person we need to control somehow. And so many people's experiences, so many of the things that have led them to these points of great distress are rooted in trauma, which is rooted in loss of power and control. And then they enter these systems that take more and more and more power and control, including identifying that person as a problem and trying to figure out how to control them to fix it. And so I so appreciate that end segment, which also makes me think of open dialogue. We're not open dialogue trained, we're not professing to do open dialogue, but it's this idea that can we actually get everyone around the table who's willing to be there, who that person is comfortable having there, and say, like, this isn't just about this person, it's about how we're all working together, how everything is coming together. And so, yeah, it makes me think of open dialogue. If you're familiar with open dialogue, one of the things I love about it the most is that it says that the problem exists in the spaces between people rather than in a particular person. One person might be most visibly struggling, but the problems exist in the spaces between people. And so that reminds me of that interaction that Marty describes there of, you know, it wasn't just about me, it was about each of us and what do we need from each other? And so I appreciate that. Now, as far as peer respite in general goes, I just want to back up and say this is the book that we produced on peer respite in general. It has a lot of Afiya information in there, but it also offers this framework that there are actually different peer respites. So far, I've mostly been focusing on what we're calling the fully peer run respite, which was reflected in that very earliest clip. It talked about, you know, it's a non-clinical organization, non-clinical building, no assessment. The board of directors generally represents a significant number of people who themselves have struggled in these particular ways. So that's generally what it takes to be a fully peer run respite. But there are a number of hybrids out there now. Second Story is one of the most well-known examples because there's a lot of research that has been rooted at Second Story, which is in California. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. But those hybrid peer respites still meet all the qualities for a peer respite in general. You know, some of the ones which I'll talk about shortly, but that they're, you know, all the people who are actually working in the peer respite are people who've struggled themselves, including leadership, but not necessarily under a non-clinical umbrella, or maybe not always in a completely, you know, disconnected from a non-clinical building. Like there was one in Maine, it doesn't exist at this point, but on one side there was a clinical respite, on the other side there was a peer respite, so that would have been considered a hybrid, for example. And then there's also peer integrated respites, which are not peer respites but are worth a mention. Those peer respites, I think particularly of the peer respite in New York State, community access peer respite or peer integrated respites, they are not considered peer respites because they don't necessarily require their leadership people to have firsthand experience, but the vast majority of people working in the respite house are people who do have firsthand experience. So if you're interested in more of those details of the charter and those 3 different categories, I would encourage you to take a look in the book that's cited here at the very end of this presentation, and we'll give you the link to get the slides directly. It will give you an online copy of this book that will give you all the much more detailed information than we have time necessarily to go through today about what each of these categories look like. Some of the pieces that you'll see in the charter, I do just want to highlight, and you'll see I put in red this human everyday language that I'm going to talk about more in a minute, but some of them are things like no or minimal paperwork. Now, where does that come from? Everything that's here, everything that I'm talking about is going to root back to how we are trying to undo some form of power imbalance or harm that's happened to people by being in these systems in the past. And paperwork's a pretty big one. If you are not someone who has your own experience or haven't been closely connected to someone, you might not know this, but our files follow us around. And so do our diagnoses. I refer to myself sometimes as having a diagnostic tail, because in my experience and many other people's experiences, when you get a new diagnosis, the other diagnosis doesn't go away. You just end up with this tail of diagnoses that trail you all over the place. And that's carried in your paperwork. I know so many people in my life who say, you know, they're still assessing me for being potentially dangerous 20 years later after I set some fire that was rooted in some particular situation, or I hit someone, or whatever happened. And there's also the reality that when we talk about power imbalance and files, those files are created through the lens of people who have the power and control in the situation. And part of that power and control includes what gets defined as dangerous or violence. So, for example, if someone was violent in the context of being restrained and hit someone, that might be in their file for a lifetime, but it might fall away the reality that actually they were experiencing violence in terms of being restrained. And And yeah, it gets painted in those particular ways. So that paperwork piece is a big deal. And I will tell you, at Afiya, this is one of the areas that we didn't quite get exactly what we wanted. Our original proposal was to not have any individual files, that we would keep, we had to have HIPAA sign-offs, that we'd keep a file of HIPAA sign-offs, but not in individual files, that we would keep a general database for research and making sure we knew how long people had been there and things like that, but not individual files, and no treatment plans. So our Department of Mental Health wanted us to have something approximating a treatment plan. And what we did as kind of a compromise was, we have this thing called Hopes for Stay. We put on the Hopes for Stay that DMH required us to have it. So we're being real transparent about why the form even exists. And it also says on there that our Department of Mental Health technically has a right to come look at it, but they never have. So all that information is right there. If someone says they don't want to fill it out, we don't fight them on it. And it really just says, hey, give us, one hope you have for your stay. And then there's a space to write something about that at the beginning, a space to write something at the end if they want to, and they can check off a box as to whether or not they met at least one of their hopes for stay at the end. And then we keep them in the basement in a locked cabinet and tell people not to look at them, because we don't want people learning about the people that might be coming back for another stay through pieces of paper that may or may not reflect what's actually going on with them. That's another harm of that paperwork. So just so you know, the only difference, I guess I would say, is if someone says, you know what, I really want people to know this and I don't want to have to say it a million times, and can you ask people to be aware of this? Sure. We're not going to be so rigid as to not work with people, but as a general principle, we're not operating out of files. We also do things like, in the interest of avoiding power imbalances, we will not handle people's psychiatric drugs. We will not handle people's money, even if they have a repayee-ship. We will support them to figure out how to do that. They can have someone, if they are not allowed to, in their current living environment, hold their own psychiatric drugs, then they can have someone stop through. It's been more challenging during the pandemic, but in general, they can have someone stop through and work with them in that way. But there has been such harm done, both in direct force and more subtle coercion, in pushing people to take psychiatric drugs they don't want to take and using their money in really questionable ways, that it's just not something that we choose to get involved with. We will, however, talk with people about whether or not they want to be on psychiatric drugs, or advocate for a change to their psychiatric drugs, or get resources if they want to come off their psychiatric drugs. There are peer respites that say that they won't do that. When we were setting ours up, we visited a number of other peer respites, and one of them said, nope, we won't have that conversation. We won't go, there are certain things we won't touch with a 10-foot pole, and people's psychiatric drugs is one of them. But I guess I just want to say to you that there aren't a lot of people out there, including people's doctors, who will have real conversations with people about their psychiatric drugs and whether or not they want to come off of them. And contrary to sometimes what gets conveyed out there about the risks of coming off of psychiatric drugs and being able to do that successfully, one of the greatest predictors, and we see this in David Cohen's work and many other people's work who've looked at this issue, one of the greatest predictors of not coming off of psychiatric drugs successfully is if you have nobody to support you to even think about what that might look like and what you need to do that. So we will absolutely have those conversations and give people resources on those topics, but we won't be a part of the systems that control them. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. So there's also no required schedule, and that can be stressful for some people. We can certainly support someone to build a schedule if they want to have things to do, if they want groups. We are a small house. We have 3 people stay at a time. Anything too much larger, there's obviously some variations, but if you get too much larger, it starts to just feel like an institution, and it can get really hard. So we keep it pretty small. And so it wouldn't make sense for us, even if we wanted to have set groups built through the whole day. But if there's people there who want to do yoga together, we've got that space, and we often hire employees intentionally who have different skill and focus areas. But we're also attached to a broader community. And for those of you who are looking to set up new peer respites, I'd encourage you to think about this. I would never try and talk someone out of having a peer respite that is isolated and not connected to other supports because oh, it's still going to be a hell of a lot better than the psychiatric units in many instances that are isolated and not connected to any other supports, at least in having an alternative. But if you can have a peer respite that is connected to a broader peer-to-peer community with other choices, so that someone doesn't have to, again, be taught to get in the cycle of, if I want this kind of support, then I need to be in some form of quote unquote crisis in order to access it, then you're just opening many more doors. And so the fact that that our peer respite is embedded in a broader peer-to-peer network where there are support groups that people can go to whether or not they're staying at the house. They can form relationships, they can go to community centers. They don't have to be in any particular state to be connected to this community, I think is really important. And so if you have the resources to think about that, I would encourage you to do so. You just see in many different ways here this avoid force and coercion. And I just, this isn't a training about suicide or hearing voices or what have you, but hopefully you all have been exposed to research that says, hey, if someone's already struggling with something like thinking about killing themselves, one of the things that is routinely being shown to increase the risk of someone thinking about or attempting to kill themselves is force or coercion. There's explicit research out there now that says even if coercion is just perceived at the entry point of a psychiatric hospitalization, the risk of suicide goes up upon discharge. And that type of research is replayed in a number of different ways. So that's just not a place we go. We are required by our Department of Mental Health to provide people with information about the local clinical crisis services, and we do that. But we do it, once again, very intentionally. We put something on the paper that says the Department of Mental Health requires us to give you this information, so we're not unintentionally sending this message that, oh, we think you're about on the brink, here's this information. So we're clear why we're giving the information, and we embed it in lots of other community information. So maybe you want the crisis service information, maybe you also want to know where the library is, or the YMCA, or the whatever. And so people have that information, and they know why they have it, because we're telling them why we're giving it to them. And we won't call crisis services on people. The only times in the nearing a decade that we've been open that we have called for some sort of emergency intervention is when there's been an actual medical emergency. And we are clear to make a difference between someone talking about suicide, even very seriously, and someone having taken a bunch of pills. We are clear that it is not a healing environment for us to sit there and watch someone die. If someone has a medical emergency due to an overdose, unintentional or intentional, if they've fallen on the floor because they've had a heart attack or what have you, we will call, because that's a medical emergency. And while hospitals have a terrible record at providing support for people who are in emotional distress, they have a pretty good record for addressing actual medical emergencies. And so we'll call in those instances. And there's been, I think, 5, maybe less in the last decade where we've had to do that. Generally speaking, when people have come on a few occasions and ended up making a suicide attempt. In one instance, there was a young woman, I think in her late teens, who had a big fight with her mother out in our driveway, and then went inside and took a bunch of pills. And, I think that happens. And it was rooted in this family conflict that had played out on our property. And so we did have to take some intervention at that point because it had become a medical emergency. And in another instance, there was a man who was unhoused, who just really was struggling with the idea of going back to the street and did attempt suicide. And again, we took an intervention. I want to be clear though, I think people get very scared about having people who are unhoused in respite settings for a number of reasons. A lot of funders say, well, we don't want to be responsible for putting people out on the street. And I think it's sort of, there's some twisted logic in there that because we don't want to be responsible for putting someone out on the street, we're just going to leave them there and pretend they don't exist, is kind of what ends up happening. And I don't think that makes a lot of sense. So we do work with people who are unhoused, not if the only need is housing, because we're not a housing facility, and we need to watch that our mission doesn't drift into something else, because in an effort to try and support everybody, we would just end up supporting nobody effectively. But if someone who's unhoused is really struggling, and being unhoused can certainly lead to great emotional struggle, then we won't cut them off. And we're just really honest up front that there's no way in a week's time that we're going to resolve every housing issue. There's just the housing resources aren't there. We'll work with them as best as we can. And we do have people who work in peer support and housing on our broader team that we can connect them with. But yeah. So that language piece I want to spend a little more time on, because this is part of the work of peer respite. This is part of the unpacking of power. You cannot create a respite without doing the work of looking at power as it exists in all its different forms. If you do that, you're going to much more likely end up creating a very co-opted sort of mini clinician version. A lot of us in the peer-to-peer world talk about the co-optation of peer support roles and how some of those roles become kind of the mini clinicians. And that looks like, you know, all the things that we're saying to steer clear of, all the power imbalances, the setting rules around psychiatric drugs and all sorts of other things, and not a lot of examination of power. And language is very, very powerful. So some of the language that we really pay attention to, that hopefully I'll just plant a seed for those of you who aren't already there, is to not use language like client, consumer, or even peer. We talk about peer support. I know this is confusing for people. We talk about peer support or people working in peer roles, but we don't refer to people as a peer. It's a kind of a corruption of that language, because peer is a relationship, not an identity. It has become this word that has become twisted up and kind of the new patient, or, you know, just means, oh, that person with a psychiatric diagnosis over there. But actually peer support is about two or more people connecting in a way that is eliminating as many power imbalances as possible, where there's some commonality in experiences. So I actually have an article on that in America called Cheers for Peers, because my daughter, when she was younger, she was in a daycare where they had a Cheers for Peers board, where the teachers would say how their peers, their other teachers, were doing great things. You know, hey, Sally, thanks for bringing me coffee. And that was their Cheers for Peers board. They knew nothing of the system that I'm working in, right? So I want to ask people to think about that word and use it cautiously. And as far as our world, we really don't go down that path of labeling people. Sometimes we'll refer to guests, but most often we just talk about people who are working at the respite and people who are staying at the respite, and we move on from there. The embedment of identities based in the mental health system can be part of what prevents people from moving on from the mental health system. If someone's identity gets built around being a part of this system, I don't know how we expect them to freely have what they need to heal and have identities that are connected to the rest of the world. It can be part of what ties them here. We also really don't use mental illness or diagnostic language, nor do we take it away from people. So if someone comes to our space talking about being mentally ill or bipolar or what have you, we will ask them questions like, well, what does that look like for you? I've known lots of people with that diagnosis. How does it show up for you? Let's explore that. Is that a diagnosis that makes sense to you? Is it working for you? But we never ask people for their diagnosis. We don't start with that foot forward, and we don't use this language of mental illness, even if someone's using it for themselves. Now, there's a difference between not using the language ourselves and trying to take it away from someone. We won't tell people who they are. There is a huge amount of power that is lost when people are told who they are and what's wrong with them and why. And we don't participate in that as much as we can. We try to create space. But we won't, you know, I hear people say, well, I won't refer to someone as mentally ill unless they refer to themselves as mentally ill, and then I will. And what I just want to offer to you as food for thought there is, well, that may feel respectful, and I absolutely support the idea that you shouldn't argue with people or try and take that language away from them if it's meaningful to them. So many people have only ever heard themselves referred to in that way. And so sometimes they are simply regurgitating what they have been taught they are supposed to believe about themselves. And in fact, what they have been taught by the system that they need to refer to themselves or actually face some punitive response. So for example, I was in a commitment hearing where I was supporting someone, and they were using the fact that she wouldn't say she was mentally ill as a justification to continue to hold her in a psychiatric facility. So people have been taught they have to refer to themselves in this way. And so while we don't want to argue with that, if we just slipped into, well, you're saying it, so I'm going to say it, we don't continue to hold that space for someone to continue to explore if that's meaningful for them. And some people, after all the exploration in the world, may still say my diagnosis and mental illness are useful terms to me, and that's fine. That has to be okay. But so many people say like, well, that was language I used at one point in my life. Thank you for making the space for me to figure out if that worked. And it's not something that works for me, not forever anyway. Similarly, things like hallucinations and delusions are not language we use. Again, this is a product of other people deciding what's true for someone, what's meaningful for someone, what is right or wrong for someone, and putting it on them. So we'll simply describe what is. All right, you're hearing a voice. What's it saying? Where did you learn that belief? Where did that come from? We'll explore those things. But built into words like hallucinations and delusions are, this isn't true, and I have the power to tell you that what you believe, what you see, what you hear is not true, not real. Medication versus drugs is a little bit of a different direction, and I think, in our community, we're still working through some of this, but I wanted to mention it here. So again, there's a lot of power in our words, and there's also a lot of marketing in our words. What gets defined as a medication and what gets defined as a drug is really interesting if you look at the history. When someone wants to market something to you, it gets defined as a medication. When someone wants to say, this is bad, you shouldn't do this, it gets labeled as a drug. So cannabis, for example, it's like moved around, right? But for a lot of our history, it's been labeled as this drug versus something like Thorazine is a medication. Which of those actually has caused more harm to people in society? I would argue the thing that's labeled a medication. This also is very racialized. So I just want to offer that. What gets classified as drug versus medication, good, bad, how the languaging happens around that is very, very racialized and has caused a lot of harm to Black and brown people in our communities. And that harm is a trauma. It is a part of the systemic oppression that leads people to these places of not feeling like they can trust being in this world or seek support from people. We also don't really use referral or intake language. It's perhaps not the worst language that you'll see on this list, but it is still language that signals a clinical environment and a lot of power. In systems that require referrals, there's usually some professional person who's decided that this is the support you need or should have access to, and there's a lot of power held in that. So we really steer clear of that kind of language as well, and really just try and keep it as basic and as direct as we can. So other key pieces that I want to mention to you before we move on to space for just questions and dialogue. Releases of information don't mean much to us. Now, this is one that often surprises clinical people. When we first started, we did not have a lot of clinical people encouraging people to come use our supports. Now we have a lot more clinical people, and even jails and probation officers and others encouraging people to seek our support. But then they also expect us to tell them exactly what's happening. And that can be a real point of conflict. And sometimes we've come at it in this very no, what are you thinking? You're part of the system. You're the man, stop it. And that's not especially effective, not especially effective. Instead, at this point, we've really learned to say, we're all people trying to do our jobs. I really believe, although I'm being very critical of the clinical system, that most people who enter the clinical system do not get into the clinical system to try and cause harm. There's certainly people who have some strange reasons. We used to, in a particular training, ask people, so why'd you start this work? And occasionally, some people will say, well, it paid better than retail. Well, okay. But most people will say, because I wanted to help people. Because someone in my family was hurting and I wanted to give back, because I was hurting and I wanted to give back. Those are the most common responses we hear. But whether you're working or getting services in a system, we're still in these systems that are pushing and pulling us and building fear and causing all these issues. And so people who are working in the system often don't get to live out what they envisioned for their jobs either. And so we recognize that. And so we really try and come from this place of look, I know you're calling and seeking this information because this is your job, and you've been told by your job that you're supposed to track what's happening and offer support and offer resources and be on top of everything. But the reality is that our job, what we're asked to do, is above all else support someone to get their voice back, to get their own power back. We use our power instead of over people to go under people and lift them up. That is how we want to use our power. And these releases of information that people have been so often institutionalized to just sign off on without a question do not represent that. And so even if you fax something to us that someone has signed, here's what's going to happen. First of all, if we see someone's name on something that you faxed us, we're going to hand it to them and say, this is yours. It's not ours. And secondly, if it's something seeking information, we're going to go to that person. We're going to say, you know, do you want to talk to that person? Do you want to give the information? Occasionally people will say, you know what, I'm afraid to have this conversation by myself. And we can say, all right, we can be there with you, and we can tell us, you know, what you want to say, or we'll use decision aids that we've developed around supported decision making, and, you know, support people to come up with what they want to say, or occasionally help them say it. But this idea that we're going to just have conversations with someone just because they've signed off on something, it's really just not how we work. We also really emphasize the importance of people being able to continue with their life in the ways they see fit. Now, there are peer respites out there. I don't think any of them are doing this at this point, but I do remember being on a call with some other peer respites, and we were talking about the use of drugs and alcohol in the peer respite, and how we were struggling in navigating that, and which of us allowed that, which of us didn't, and all that. And one peer respite said, well, we don't have an issue with that because we don't let people go out unless they're without their case, or they're with their case manager. Like, well, you know, that's not a peer respite. It's just not. If you have that level of control over whether or not someone leaves the space, that's not in the spirit of self-determination and people getting their power back. It's just not. So there's that. But, you know, even beyond that, there's this idea, and some of it comes from health insurance and the way our systems and our healthcare systems work. If somebody's able to go to work or able to go to school, then they must not be sick enough to need this service, or they're too quote unquote high functioning, which is such a harmful term in and of itself. And we just don't go there. It doesn't resonate with our experience. And it has caused so much harm in these systems of people, in fact, sometimes being pushed to get worse in order to get access to any sort of support. And so what we believe, what we know from our own experience, what we know from our lives and our community is that sometimes just getting up and having something that you're really needed to do, like going to work or spending some time with your child or what have you, that's actually what's keeping someone going. Why would we want to take that away? If that's like one of the few things that's tethering someone to this world and keeping them going, why would we want to potentially cause someone to lose their housing or lose their job by not having access to it? Because that's not going to help. If someone was already in distress and then they lose their job because they're not showing up to it, how have we helped? So we absolutely, it's a key part of peer respite that people get to choose what they're able to stay connected to, what is helpful for them to stay connected to. And sometimes they need an entire break, and we can support them in figuring that out too. So we also just want to highlight that people working at respites are valued not just for their psychiatric diagnosis or the problems they've experienced, but also for the power they've lost. This gets back to some of the earlier points I was making. When we talk about quote unquote lived experience or who gets designated as a quote unquote peer or what have you, in the conventional system, and even more broadly than that, it's so often focused on whether or not someone's been diagnosed or been to therapy or been to treatment. And that's a piece of it. You know, having been navigated the treatment system allows someone to have knowledge that will support someone else to navigate the treatment system. Absolutely. But we really want in our employees for there to be people who have also experienced what it's like to lose power. Now, sometimes the who gets to be in a peer support role gets muddied because there's also family members there's family partners, for example, in our states who it's designated as a peer role. And there is value in being a family partner. There's so much value. And I know there's family members in the room here and having navigated the system as a family member. But it doesn't include the same personal individual loss of power and experience of systemic oppression that it does when you are actually losing your liberty because you've been locked in a psychiatric facility, or being told by probation that you must take your psychiatric drugs, or being on these various orders that different states have where you have to take psychiatric drugs even if you are falling down because of the psychiatric drugs. It's different. I know there's powerlessness that family members experience as well in terms of what resources they have and ability to support their family members and how painful that can be. I've had some struggles with my own kids as well, but I just, it's so important that we recognize and value and honor the loss of power that people who've actually been diagnosed and been in some of these systems have experienced, and that we prioritize that in the employees that we hire to take on these roles. And this last piece I'm going to highlight here that's really a key, and hopefully you've heard hints of this in the other things that I'm saying, is that there's lots of room in peer respite, and there has to be lots of room in peer respite for self-injury, suicidal thoughts, distressing voices, and all the other things that get identified as problems to be actually seen as adaptations and attempts to solve problems. So rather than the problem, they are attempts to find solutions. I am someone who has a long history of self-injury. I've been locked up against my will because of my self-injury, because people saw it as me being suicidal, and they saw their one directive as get me to stop, get me to stop. And I wish people had bothered to ask me, and I will just share with you briefly this piece of my story. Had people asked me why I was self-injuring, I would have said something along the lines of, there's times when I feel so far outside of my body that I feel like I'm looking down at myself. And when I hurt myself, it helps ground me. And in this world where I've experienced all this emotional pain that I cannot control, this is a physical pain I can control, and that provides a relief. And even though you see this as me trying to kill myself, it's actually the very best way I have found to keep myself alive. And you just took it away from me when you put me in the psychiatric facility. And so that's my experience. It's my experience that self-injury was an attempt at a solution. And even suicidal thoughts or suicide itself can be an attempt at eliminating pain from other things that are going on in people's lives. Hearing voices can be an attempt at making meaning of experiences. I also am someone who's seen visions that were really frightening, that were telling me to hurt my daughter when she was a baby. And when I really had space in a peer-to-peer environment to figure out where that was coming from, I was able to make that connection that those visions weren't actually telling me to hurt my daughter. They were telling me that I was still blaming myself for the 2 miscarriages I had before my daughter was born, that my body had hurt it by the way my mind was perceiving it, these other 2 babies. And I needed to work through that in order to move forward. So it was a message for me. And it was only by being in those peer-to-peer environments where there was a space to talk about those scary things and make meaning of them, that I was able to make those connections, and that those visions lost their power over me. I don't think I ever really felt like I was actually going to hurt my daughter, but they're very scary. And I was thinking about suicide a lot there. And that is what these environments are meant to make space for. And the moment we come in and start layering on the clinical ideas that suicide's bad, self-injury is bad, you must just make it all go away, we lose that power. So I'm going to do a little bit on research, and then I'm going to ask y'all for questions. And I know Kathy's been also keeping track of the questions that are probably already in the chat that I'm not looking at because it distracts me to try and keep it all. So this is just some data that I took from a fiscal year annual report from 2017. We haven't been doing quite the same method of reports in our most recent years. So we're just pulling from some slightly older reports, but this is just to give you a sense. So we have a 3-bedroom house. We'll take 3 people at a time. And in 2017, anyway, that fiscal year, we saw 107 people over the course of 174 stays. So you can tell from that there are some people who do come back. We do have to pay attention to, we don't, our effort is always to try and create a bridge rather than a life raft. We talk about that a lot, particularly in our alternatives to suicide training. So we don't want to just have the peer respite become another life raft, the only thing that is helping someone exist. But sometimes we've seen people who were in and out of the hospital constantly make a shift to coming to the peer respite, and in order to make that transition, they have come repeatedly. And then we need to work with them on an individual basis and say, like, well, has this become now the thing that you're dependent on? How do we keep broadening? How do we keep deepening the connection to the community? Now, this I include simply to say, like, oh, we need more. You know, we exist. We are in Western Massachusetts. It is by far not the most populated part of this country, but we are in an area that has, I think, something like, it's changed a little bit, 8 acute psychiatric units in the area with all sorts of beds. And we have 1 peer respite with 3 bedrooms. You know, it's not going to meet the need. It's not going to be able to fully realize the impact of alternative to hospitalization. Those of you who are thinking of starting new peer respites in your area, advocate for as much as you can to not just have 1 house in this giant geographical area, because it will mean that it's probably always going to be full, and it will interrupt the ability for someone who's really in distress in the moment being able to have a place that's not a hospital to go to still. So we're still struggling with that. And you see from this that, oh yeah, we field a lot of phone calls, and a huge number of them we have to say, I'm sorry, we're full. Now we do keep a wait list. We keep a wait list of 3 people. We keep it to 3 people because we know that sometimes people, if they have somewhere that they know they're going to be able to go in a few days, then they can kind of hang on. And we also added a few years ago a community bridger who works for their peer respite, who can work with people who are either on the wait list or who've recently left to ease that transition. But if it gets to be more than 3 people, well, we have 3 bedrooms, it's a week-long stay. And then if we have a wait list that's more than 3 people, then the wait could get longer than a week. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We don't want to be like, all right, yeah, in a few months, we might have an opening. Sorry, you better plan ahead. So the idea is to keep it within about a week's wait as much as possible. But you can see that the need is pretty significant still. Now, when we do 2 different surveys, we do one right at the end of someone's stay, and then we'll send out follow-up surveys. This is really this is the earlier one, the one that people complete initially. And we ask them to just let us know and not everyone who comes has been in a clinical respite or a hospital, but for those who are, we ask them to rate these different areas of, you know, how helpful the peer respite or the environment was, you know, how they experienced freedom and choices. Did that environment address injustice, and did that environment treat them with dignity? And you'll see, unsurprisingly, that Afiya, that the peer respite environment scores higher in all those areas. What was a little bit surprising to me was that the clinical respite and hospital were pretty on par. You know, I think a lot of people think of the clinical respites as having a lot more freedom than the locked psychiatric units. I know they vary from state to state, but at least in this state, the clinical respites, although they had a little bit more freedom in some ways to offer, weren't really scoring that much higher overall in these areas. Now, what was most helpful? You'll see here a big range of different things that people found most helpful when they were staying there. And some of them are really simple things like catch up on sleep. You saw Marty talking about the ability to not be on a schedule and to sleep when she wanted to sleep and be awake when she wanted to be awake. Many clinical environments only see someone as doing well if they're getting up in the morning, regardless of what psychiatric drugs they're taking. You need to get up at a certain time. You need to attend these groups. You need to go to bed when we say to go to bed. I will tell you, when I was in a psychiatric facility, the moment they told me that the phones got turned off at, I think it was 11 o'clock and everyone was supposed to go to bed, was the exact moment I decided I was going to stay up all night long at all costs. Why? Because I was trying to retain some sort of power in my life, some sort of control in my life in an environment that was trying to take it all. Here, we don't get into those power struggles, and we recognize that we might not see someone for the first few days of their stay if what they need more than anything else is to rebalance their sleep cycles, and that's okay. So having that freedom and all these other pieces you see here were really important for people. Now, this comes from the follow-up survey. And you'll see that, as is consistent with some of the other research I'm going to tell you about in a few minutes, things like fewer hospitalizations for people who did have a history of being in psychiatric facilities ranked fairly high. Overall, just emotional well-being and relationships and connections to other were the two highest. But one I want to highlight here, I'm not going to talk about all of them, is setting personal goals. Now, it's not the highest. About a third of people said that they saw an improvement in setting personal goals. And in some of our years, that has been even higher. It's often hit the top 5 of what people found was the biggest improvement. And I think it's interesting because we do not require people to set personal goals. We are one of the only treatment environments that people can enter in the state that does not require people to set personal goals. Now, most of the environments where they do get required to set personal goals are environments where it has to be a measurable goal, and it's often actually being pushed on from someone else. Things like medication compliance, quote unquote. Compliance is another word we don't use because we find it to be quite violent language. Many of us have trauma histories where we come from people early in our lives telling us that we're bad if we don't do what we're told we're supposed to do. And then we enter treatment environments that tell us we're bad if we don't do what we're told we're supposed to do. And we find that harmful. But that aside, a lot of the goals people are required to set in those environments are things like treatment compliance or take 3 showers a week or things that aren't so meaningful to people, or if they were meaningful to begin with, like sometimes people say like, well, I wanted to do that yoga class until it showed up in my treatment plan. And then I'm like, well, I'm not so sure I want to do that yoga class anymore. Or what happens if I don't like it? Am I then seen as failing treatment? It's no longer mine. That's what tends to happen in these rigid goal environments. But what we've found is in an environment that just creates space for people talking about what they want and doesn't have a rigid expectation of measurable goals that get charted and all that sometimes people are better able to set goals. So that goes back to that idea of how important power and control are in people's lives. So this is some research from beyond. A lot of the research has happened around Second Story. There was a SAMHSA grant that supported Second Story to be researched. And although Second Story is a hybrid model that, I think has brought some challenges. One of the things that was useful about the way it was initially set up, which also included a limited number of people being able to access it, was that it meant that they could follow those people's experiences beyond the respite. And so while I wouldn't encourage people to set up a peer respite where only people receiving certain services can access it and it's under a clinical setting, in this particular instance, it helped with the research element of it. And what Second Story did find was that looking at people who stayed at Second Story between that set amount of time, that they found that even a short stay at Second Story reduced the number of subsequent hours spent in emergency and inpatient service use. Now, that sometimes people will say like, oh, peer respite is so short. Can it really be helpful? I absolutely think there's needs for other longer term environments like Soteria, and there's a New Hampshire effort that is starting up that's not Soteria or quite peer respite, but something in between them that's going to be a few months stay. I think those things are critical for people who need them. But I think peer respite, and this is one of the pieces of evidence that supports this, can be so impactful, even short stays. And interestingly, what they also found into this research was that after the 2-week mark, the benefit to reduction in use of other emergency services started to go down. So this is also, I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of a coughing fit. This is also, I believe, Second Story based, this research. And what they found was that when a good balance between self-reliance and social connectedness is struck, peer respite guests report strengthening their ability to manage crisis. Now, why this is tricky, sorry, why this is tricky is simply because I do think peer respites are faced with the challenge of trying to balance those two elements, and that's why it's framed in this way. So a lot of choice happens in peer respites, but also there's this emphasis around building connections with other people staying, the broader community, and so on. And that doesn't just magically necessarily happen. So I think in peer respites, we do sometimes struggle with all right, how much do I want to invite this person into this conversation or into whatever's happening before I cross the line and start to seem like I'm pressuring this person to not take time by themselves or be doing something or what have you. So that balance can be really tricky, and that's why it's framed in this way. But in general, when that balance can be struck reasonably well, the sense of empowerment, you heard some of this in what Marty was saying in her clip too, the sense of like, oh, I can take some control. I can rely on myself. I'm not just hopeless. I don't just need everyone controlling me all the time. That can really grow. And so I think that is a powerful finding. At the end here, I just want to mention too that the World Health Organization, if you're not already aware, just released some new guidance on the importance of rights-based approaches across the world. And they highlighted, I think it was around 25 different programs, groups, systems, and Afiya was one of them. And it was because they really wanted to represent Peer Respite in there. And also you'll see Soteria House, the Hearing Voices Network. I'm also on Hearing Voices USA Board of Directors. I know some of you through some of that work there as well. So I know some of you are quite familiar with that. Open Dialogue, which is of course a clinical system, but that shares many of the values that we're talking about here as well, that they're all in there. And I wanted to highlight this, not because it's not quite research, but I think it's really important that the World Health Organization, United Nations, so many different groups internationally are now beginning to emphasize the importance of supports that look at people's rights, that look at loss of power, that, there was the UN quote that we've used a bunch, hopefully you all have heard, that says we need to stop looking at chemical imbalances and start looking at power imbalances if we're really going to support people to heal. So I think this is good for you, those of you particularly who are seeking to develop peer respites in your area, that something like the World Health Organization is now saying, yeah, like peer respite is one of a handful of practices that we really would suggest that you look at. Now, I'm going to, again, leave you with these links here. So that top link is to this actual slide deck. And then you'll see that the link to the guidance from the World Health Organization is in there, the Peer Respite Handbook. You can either buy one off of Amazon or just look at a free online copy, the full film, our website. And then the Peer Respite Actions and Evaluation site, it was organized by Leisha Ostrow and others, and includes a lot of the research that I've mentioned and more. So with that, I really want to turn it over to all of you for any questions, thoughts, reflections that you may have. And I know, Kathy, you've been keeping track of the chat.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. There was a lot of good conversation and dialogue in the chat that I think would be interesting to take a look at, but some specific questions. Are there discussions happening regarding levels of need when people seek space in limited numbers of peer respite homes?
Yeah, I think it's really challenging to figure out how to do this well. Honestly, for the most part, we anyway function on okay, do we have a space or not? And is this person who's calling us in touch right now, do they have a need, rather than saying, okay, we have 3 people who called today, which one it has the greatest need? I think that, I think there's benefits and there's pluses and minuses to all the different ways you could approach it. I think there are some times when we say, oh, we've had a lot of people come through lately who seem like they could benefit, but then by having them in the house, we miss the people who are really at risk of ending up in a psychiatric facility. And so sometimes as a team, we'll just try and pay attention to, like, do we feel like our mission is drifting? And I think that's really important. It's not about talking about individual people. We really try and steer clear of that as much as possible. But, as a house, as a offering, have we steered so far over here that people are just calling us when they're having a little bit of hard time or wanting a little extra support, versus the people who are really at risk of ending up in jail or a psychiatric facility, and which side meets our mission and what questions could we be asking or looking at things differently. I think it would get really tricky And I guess I really wouldn't recommend that we or others do that other thing that I was mentioning, which is like try and actually compare people. I think the systems, it's focus. It's we're forced into this place because of this kind of like scarcity model that we're operating under, where there's not enough resources to go around. In a perfect world, there would just be, if someone's saying I'm struggling, there'd be a support that they could access, and we wouldn't have to come from the scarcity place. But I think if we start trying to do that, if we start trying to guess who's really struggling, then we fall into all sorts of traps, and some of them will reinforce a lot of other forms of systemic oppression. If people have culturally come from a place where it's really unfamiliar to just spill everything that's happening, they might seem like they're struggling a lot less. Whereas someone who's come from a culture or been trained to just spill everything might seem like they're coming from a place of greater distress. And I think we don't want to get into that place. I think that place, there's a lot of harm to be found there. So I think it's more about just taking a step back, building in times to take a step back and saying, have we drifted from our mission, and how can we keep advocating to our funders that actually we need to have lots of different options rather than, just trying to hold these 3 bedrooms.
Thank you. There are a couple questions I'm going to group together. The first is, do you take items away from people? Are there knives in the house? And the second one, somewhat related, could you address how you work with discomfort and not knowing, and anxiety in peer supporters when guests are seriously distressed and not knowing how to go on, and energies appear to flow in make unknown ways?
Okay. So there's definitely knives around the house. We don't take away sharps or anything like that. I think that a lot of us have been, we've been in environments where people have communicated lack of trust in us through taking away sharps or things like that. And the reality is, I don't know if this is necessarily comforting, but if you've seen our Afiya film, you'll already know this. We did have one violent incident in the house. It happened in 2015. And someone who'd been staying there did attack one of our employees in a very serious way. But he actually didn't do it with any of the really sharp knives. He used scissors, and it would have been an exercise in futility if we tried to lock up all the sharpest stuff. He still was able to access something. And when we took a step back and we looked at that situation, what we found was, oh, this is a situation where we didn't live up to our own standards. We typically, if someone is saying that they want to come in, we'll have a conversation with them to the best of our and their ability as to what's going on. And in this situation, we allowed ourselves to be pressured by a clinical respite. This person had run out of insurance, and they were looking for somewhere for this person to go. This person didn't really express a lot of genuine interest in being there. The clinical person stayed in the room the entire time. And we should have asked that person to leave, and we really should have talked to that person directly. And as it turned out, that person wasn't really all that interested in being at the respite. What they wanted was to steal a car and take off and go wherever they want. And that was where the violence happened. And yeah, so what we learned from that was not take away the sharps, because, there's lots of things that people can use, especially if they're able to freely come and go. It just really is about creating an illusion in the moment. What we learned was we really, really need to pay attention to whether or not someone actually is choosing to be there, and really stick to our values even more. We haven't had anything of that nature happen either before or since then. But, people do come in with knives. There's a certain reality we have to accept, especially with people who are unhoused. People who are unhoused very commonly have knives on the street. There's very dangerous environments that they're living in where they've kind of been set up to fight to keep their belongings and things like that. If someone did come in with something like that and they're honest with us about it, we do have the capacity to have a safe in our, like this one room where we have a safe and a computer that we use where they can stick that. So like, we wouldn't want them carrying it all over the house with them, but we wouldn't expect people we wouldn't eliminate people for having something like that, because that's real. That's about survival out in the world. We would just have honest conversations. We don't search people. Again, That's come up as a question, and I get that people are just trying in a scary world to look for ways to feel less afraid of what could happen. But again, unless we're saying you can't leave here, then we're just creating an illusion. We could search someone, we could create all sorts of mistrust. I know for me, if anyone is going through my personal belongings, it's just really going to cause me a lot of emotional distress. So we could do that, and then they could leave and go get a knife if they really wanted to go get a knife. So unless we're controlling everything, we're just creating all these illusions at the expense of our actual relationships with people. So we really function from a place of trust, and we do have a kitchen and there are knives, and yeah, except in that situation that has not resulted in anything terrible, and we try to be clear that terrible things are happening in this world. I mean, you only need to like flip on Facebook or the news or something to hear how much terrible is going on. And there's no guarantee anywhere, but we really push back against this idea that because people are struggling, this is where it's most likely to happen. Actually, as we've heard, it's in the movie theaters, the supermarkets, all over the place. And we need to not kid ourselves and do things that will harm people just because we're trying to act to make things feel safer. I feel like a lot of legislation happens in that way. Something awful happens, and then suddenly new legislation is passed so that people feel like someone is doing something, but that legislation often doesn't actually help, wouldn't have prevented what happened, and sometimes can actually cause bigger problems. So we don't go down that path. The other piece around, living with the unknown with our team, it's a big deal, and when I refer to those clinicians who are struggling with suicide, it's a big deal for everybody. We're all struggling with what's going to happen to people. And some of it's about, I really care about people. And if I got into this work to support people, I don't want to see people harmed. And some of it's about, oh my God, if something bad happens and it happens when I was considered responsible, then will I be legally liable? And even more than legal liability, people talk about legal liability all the time. And frankly, the risk of being successfully held legally liable for things like suicide is way lower than people think it is. But there's this emotional liability anyway. So if something awful happens, even if you're not going to be legally held responsible, it is very painful to be investigated. It is very painful to have people looking at you and saying, could you have done anything different here? It is very painful to look at yourself and say, this terrible thing happened. Could I have done something different? Should I have done something different? So it's a very real issue. And what we do is we talk about that openly. We talk about that openly. We talk about the reality that we can't control many things that the system attempts to contort itself and other people to control. We talk about the reality that there's these two paths that we can go down. There's the path that I think the system tends to go down, which is control people as much as possible, use as much force, push people in this direction in an effort to not lose people. And then there's this other path we can choose where we accept we're going to lose people because we've been losing people since life began. And we're not going to force or try to control. We're going to try and create space so that people want to live and try and build the resources so people want to live. And we often are just having these conversations internally and then in our trainings and saying, like, which path actually leads to greater loss? The one where we focus on control and power, in spite of the fact that research is telling us control and power, taking control and power increase suicide rates and increase all sorts of distress, or the one where we accept that there's going to be some loss and we can just do the best we can and trust each other and create the space. And I will always argue, and I think the statistics back me up, that we lose more people down that control and power taking path. So we have those conversations. We also encourage our team to participate in trainings where those conversations are happening, because that's the work we need to. There's an article I wrote that I would encourage you all to look at if you're interested in this topic more, called, should I ever ask someone if they're suicidal? And it includes an infographic that is about assessing you, the supporter, not the person needing support. And it asks us to turn everything on its head and say, like, are you in a position where you've done enough work to not be acting out of fear all the time so that you're being driven by your own fear and doing something to the person you're trying to support in order to manage your own fear? Have you done that work? That's part of what that infographic asks. And a lot of people haven't done that work to be able to separate out what they're doing to manage their own fear versus what they're doing to actually support somebody with what they're struggling with. And so, we have those conversations. We also encourage people to participate in things like death cafes. Death cafes aren't specific to suicide or hearing voices or anything. They're specific to talking about death, which is taboo all on its own. And maybe if we as a culture got more comfortable talking openly about birth and death and menopause and miscarriage and all the different things that we kind of tuck away and don't talk about, then we could be less afraid in these moments as well. So that's a lot of the work that we do. We also have an on-call system. So anyone who does feel really stuck or has a really hard interaction is encouraged to debrief with someone else. And we have team meetings, and with intentional peer support, there's also something called co-reflection that isn't about talking about the person you were supporting, but is about talking about, like, what is this bringing up for me? When I have this interaction and I get really freaked out, or I shut down, or what is it touching in me, and what work do I need to continue to do? And we try to bring that in as much as possible. We have people internal to our team who are trained in intentional peer support and try to keep that alive.
Thank you. There were several questions about substance use. What are the guidelines around substance use and how those are supported? What about alcohol, drugs, marijuana? How do you handle the use of cannabis, alcohol, or other substances in the house? Are they permitted?
Yeah, this has been a challenging thing for us. We are not entirely dry, but nor are we like, yeah, go for it. It impacts no one. What we try to do is we try to focus on the impact something has on the environment. So we often do have people who are staying at the house who are trying to stay sober, trying not to use drugs. And so if someone is going through the house and smelling like alcohol, that is going to impact them. So we try to consider both needs. And there is a reality that when people are using a lot of alcohol or drugs, they have tended to be less respectful, at least in some instances of the space. So we do have a real clear line of not using drugs or alcohol in the space. Sorry. With the exception of, cannabis, things that have been legalized. We're not looking to attract additional negative attention to the house. I apologize. So we do try to draw those lines. So if someone, for example, has lots of Nips bottles in their rooms, that would be an issue. We're going to have a conversation with them. They might be asked to leave for that. I'm sorry. But if they just come back smelling like alcohol, then we may just be asking them to go take a shower or stay out of the common space or something like that. We don't have an assumption that people who are using drugs or alcohol are necessarily doing anything bad. We very much come from a harm reduction place overall. There are many people in our community who are drug users, and we don't see them as necessarily bad or doing something wrong. We look at, how is it impacting your life? And is it something that you want to change? And if it's not something you want to change, how can you reduce the impact that any negative impact it is having on your life, or risks that you're facing as a result? And so we try to balance those things, and it can get really challenging when you have people in the house who are both struggling. But for the most part, what we do is just focus on the common areas and not having people use. And honestly, it's the same with self-injury. If someone is self-injuring, we see that as a harm reduction issue. If somebody wants to change that, we'll work with them on that. We do ask people not to cut or burn themselves or do things like that in common areas, but if they do that in their room, then, and that's a part of how they've adapted and are managing their distress, then we won't even push a conversation about needing to change that on them, as long as they're also partnering with us to navigate the impact on the house. So I hope that makes sense. And I apologize for the coughing. I was sick earlier in the week, and occasionally these coughing fits come, and I'm just at their whim.
Thank you, Sarah. Do you offer to stay in touch with people after they leave?
So I mentioned earlier the Bridger that we have, and the Bridger, it's a very small role, only 15 hours a week, but that community Bridger can stay in connection with people after they leave if they want it. We're not going to force it on them, but they can do things like go to an appointment with someone to advocate for a resource, or go to a different community center or resource and help them get connected there, or even within the Wildflower Alliance, go to a support group with them. You know, again, part of what I was saying earlier is I think we make a mistake when we have all these isolated supports, that in order to access, someone needs to have something really big going on. So as much as possible, we want to have an array of supports and help people get connected to them. And that's part of what that bridger will do, usually for, you know, up to a month or so after the person will leave, based on, you know, availability.
There was some really good dialogue in the chat that I think the slides that you had around language and how you wove that in, I think brought up a lot for folks. But two in particular I want to mention. One is, why do you use treatment team in the context of this conversation? And another piece around language was, if peer is not the right word, then what is the right word instead for people working at the respites?
So treatment team, I may not have been clear enough. We don't use treatment team in terms of our own community at all. When I was using treatment team, I was intending to refer to clinical systems and treatment teams that exist in clinical systems. So we really don't use that language. We do use team member, I guess, you know, and team itself can have its own connotations. That has been the most palatable word for us as far as anything that refers to our whole employee group. But you know, I've also certainly heard people say like, oh, usually when someone refers to my team, they're referring to like that team that will sit on the other side of the table, and then there's me. So, you know, we're aware of that, and often we do just say a person working at, or a person who's staying at. And then what was the other piece?
If peer is not the right word, what's the right word for someone working at the peer respite?
So I wish I had this called up and I could just give you the link right now, but I don't at the moment. But there's an article I wrote a long time ago that kind of gets at that question. It's like, is there one right word? I would say there is no one right word. The moment that we start looking for the one right word to call everyone who's in a particular system, we start feeding into developing identities that attach them to that system. Darby Penny, who some of you probably know, she lives in New York State, and she's done a lot of really great work around peer support and research. And I remember her saying, you know, we could start calling people acorns, and then acorn would become the bad word. Part of it is institutionalizing. The institutionalization that can happen with language and calling a particular group all one thing, that's part of the problem. With peer, like I was saying earlier, part of the problem is that it's just a corruption of that word. When we allow, like, I am not a peer, because a peer cannot stand alone. A peer is a relationship. It has to be the focus on the relationship, the connection with others. And unfortunately, part of what happens when we allow the corruption of that word is we see all around us in clinical systems, people hiring a peer and thinking that all that means is, oh, someone who's been diagnosed. It facilitates some of that co-optation that we're trying to prevent against. And if we could get back to this idea that, like, no, peer support is about connections between people who don't have a lot of power over one another, that is actually more at the heart of it than just like, oh, someone who's been diagnosed who you can put over there. But I would say, yeah, in order to get the right word, we need to not have the right word. We need to get rid of that idea that there is a right word, and we need to start using more words. You know, when I talk about myself, I talk about myself as someone who's been in the system, someone who's experienced psychiatric oppression, someone who's like, I use all sorts of different words. When I talk about other people and I can't use their name, I'll say things like, you know, someone I've been supporting, or, you know, someone I met through my work. There's just so many different ways to say it. And occasionally people will say like, well, I need to have one word so people know what I'm talking about. And I promise you that most of these ways of speaking, people understand. And if they don't understand, or if someone says like, oh, someone I've been working with, and they say, oh, do you mean someone you're supporting, or a coworker, you can clarify. And that's okay too. And sometimes those like moments of confusion actually create more space for better understanding. people make so many assumptions too when we start using like one word for everything. It happens with diagnoses too. If you lined up 100 people who've been diagnosed with bipolar, they are very different people. I promise you, they're very, very different people. But when we go to a class, you know, if I go to a class and I talk about people who are diagnosed with bipolar, they get images, they make assumptions. And this is part of what we want to break out of. So I think, yeah, the key is more words. And sometimes that's difficult. Sometimes it's challenging. I know it is, but hopefully we can work on it together.
Thank you, Sarah. I know that Grace has some things that she wants to bring up. Do we have time, Grace, for one last question? There were a number of questions on financing, and just maybe just very briefly how Afiya is financed.
Sure.
So our primary funder is through the state, the Department of Mental Health. There are different funders throughout the country for different peer respites. There are some, I think New Jersey's getting their funding through Medicaid. I would caution those of you who are considering Medicaid funding because it tends to come with strings like medical necessity. I know people are working on how to do that creatively, but like the Georgia Peer Respites, they have peer supporters who are Medicaid reimbursable, and then the peer respites, at least last I knew, intentionally did not go down that path of Medicaid reimbursement because they saw that it was encouraging co-optation of the peer support roles outside of the peer respite. So I would just say extreme caution with that. A Second Story had gotten some funding through SAMHSA, as I mentioned. There were a lot of strings that came with that, but I think they made good use of them while they had it. Some people have found some private funding foundations. As you all know, I'm sure it can be really hard to find not only enough funding, but enough funding that will repeat over the years. We would love to continue to diversify our funding. If nothing else, even just having little pockets of people doing crowdfunding or donation allows us, whenever we do something that the state doesn't like, to say like, no, it's that person funding that thing you don't like, you know? So that can be really helpful, and I would encourage you to think about that. But states, community development block grants, those sorts of things have been pretty successful.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This was fantastic. There's so many thank yous in the chat. I want everybody to stay just for a couple minutes. Remember, please, to, so I want to give some time to my colleague, Cindy Fisher, for a moment to make a really important announcement. I want to remind everybody here, though, if you're not signed up for Rethinking Psychiatry's future events, please put it in the either in the chat and we will do it, or go there yourself. It's just rethinkingpsychiatry.org. Press the red button to sign up, and press the blue button to see the video of this. We have recorded it, and we're going to post it to our YouTube channel, hopefully within a day, and then you can share it with all your colleagues and legislators and funders and everybody you know. Let's see. And we also put the link to the slides in the URL, and we'll hopefully post that along with it in the on the YouTube channel. So I want to again thank you, Sarah. This is fantastic. We Rethinking Psychiatry and Mind Freedom International and some other groups are planning a peer respite Soteria summit to help everybody who wants one of these amazing alternatives in their community, who's like, this sounds great, but how do we make it happen? How do we bring it to our community? We are going to try to help give people tools and resources and all kinds of things. So also let us know if you're interested in that. We'll add you to, if you actually just sign up on Rethinking Psychiatry, you'll also get information about that. If you want to help plan that, please join us and just let us know in the chat about that. I am hoping Cindy Fisher is available. Cindy, are you available?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. I want to turn it over to Cindy to let everybody know about what is going on with her hunger strike. So here we go.
I have a question first about Sera, and thank you so much, Sera. This is like so inspiring and more deeply informing. So if there are, and I guess it's also a question for Kathy, if there are a lot of questions that perhaps didn't get answered, would Sera, you be up for an interview to answer the rest of them, if there are a lot?
Sure. Yeah, people can reach out to me or interview or whatever makes sense.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
And Cindy, I'm trying to put you on the video, but apparently it looks like your video is off. So turn on your video if you're open to it, and then everybody can see you as you talk.
So I was looking at my notes so I could keep very concise. So I'm going to freeze a picture and go back to my notes so I can be very concise, because I kind of wrote it out and it should take me less than a minute, but I want to hit all the points of it. So this is my 8th day of a hunger strike on liquid only. And I'm taking this extreme action to call attention to the egregious harm that is being done to my adult child at Western State Hospital in Washington. It's a state hospital that has been deemed so dangerous that it's been defunded, all $53 million completely cut off by Medicare, as well as decertified. So it's operating under no accountability to any outside main organization. And he's being kept well beyond the discharge date, and the date actually got revoked after I wrote a letter to them threatening to do a hunger strike if they didn't give him a discharge date, because he was growing very, very despaired and hopeless, because they said, you're ready for discharge, but they weren't giving us a date. We're almost 90 days past that. So all the details will be put up on my website today. It's called regroundinglove.com. And what I'm asking you to do is to call, educate, and please donate. I will have the information where you can call Western State and ask them to immediately discharge Siddhartha to his home, where there was already a complete wraparound team through, it's called the True Blood Settlement, but everything was in place when the medical director reacted, I think, to my letter. And then educate yourself as much as you can about soteria and the respite house, because that is the answer to keep folks in the community and help us all heal and recover as we learn to care for each other. And please donate. I'm a fierce advocate, and that's where my focus is, bringing the support into the community. And in the meanwhile, I'm a victim of a ring in Vancouver that's stealing catalytic converters, and my window got broken. So a lot of things are happening on top of my activism. So thank you. Regroundinglove.com is my website.
Thank you, Cindy. I want to let people know that if they want to stay on for a while and talk together, we will turn off the recording now, but we'll stay on for a while. And anybody who wants to can do some community building, even though our community is around the world right now. So thank
Grace,
you.
I wanted to correct something. I said a ring of thieves, and I don't like labels. I want to move away from that. And so there's a ring of folks who are desperately meeting their needs by stealing the converters from Toyota. But they're people that no doubt have been deeply traumatized. So, yeah.
Thank you. So cool. So I'm stopping the recording.